How's everyone doing? Feeling good after lunch? Yeah? I hate interrupting, so why don't we just make it a group chat? Is that all right? Well, what we thought we'd do, given that there was such a stimulating conversation earlier this morning and into lunch, what we thought we'd do is take about 15, 20 extra minutes to continue chatting about some of the themes that emerged and what you all are excited about hearing in terms of safety and accountability from some amazing critical perspectives this afternoon. So before our speakers join us, we thought we'd just throw open the mic to share some thoughts that maybe themes that came out from this morning that we didn't get to delve into, things you're excited to hear and ask about in our next session. Anything you want, go for it. And I'll run mics.
Yeah, thank you. I've been really thinking about, okay, so maybe one basic fact is that refugees need ID, like any of us, right? And we can't disregard that fact that they need some form of ID. But one thing I think that would be really interesting for us to explore as we move forward is what could the alternative look like than what we have currently? Whether we're using design justice principles as a way to design them, or other principles, what I feel like what's really lacking is what is the alternative? Because the option is UNHCR. What are the alternatives that folks can come up with? And if refugees were given the option to design their own process, to come up with the alternative, to think about what factors they would consider, what would that be? And I feel like because we're always firefighting this, we just don't have the space to imagine what a better future and what a better alternative could be. And if we could, I feel like if we could discuss that a bit more, I think we all can leave a bit more hopeful at the end of the 2 weeks, yeah.
That's terrific. Does anyone have like an immediate thought or response to that? Do you want to go then?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and which is one of the things I also do whenever I'm working. I try to acknowledge my own positionality, even in ethnography, and like when we ask what's the alternative, it's like also giving them agency, like asking, I don't know if people are interested in doing some sort of ethnographic, research into that, like asking how do you think, like asking refugees now, how do you think, you would want to be identified, in terms of digital identification, like what do you think would be the best method of approach to that? So I think doing that would, on the one hand, establish our own positionality as probably researchers, as ethnographers, as or whatever capacity we are going into research for, but it also gives them some form of agency and power in choosing how they would want to be addressed and identified.
And Lauren, you had some thoughts?
I really like the idea in principle, but at the same time, and this is why I like this case, because it is so complicated and it doesn't have those like easy answers. Like just thinking, even as a researcher and ethnographer, to have access to a refugee site requires going through a lot of like nation-state level processes, which kind of makes you think about like, okay, positionality in a different way. Like, okay, what am I gonna tell them that I'm gonna do there? Am I gonna be able to like, how am I gonna talk to a bunch of folks who are already traumatized and depressed and, feeling isolated? Who would be the right person to do that kind of work, right? Like as an ethnographer or a researcher, am I the right person, or are there other proxies to do that? And then how to do that kind of work without making sure the funding, the support doesn't get sort of corrupted or co-opted is, super challenging. So I love the sort of provocation to bring design justice into this space, but I also wonder like if we could, and this was something we were discussing during lunch, like is there a way to, instead of working with refugees, is there a way to like study up or speak up and use design justice principles to invert the power mechanisms and expose the problems that make those communities vulnerable in the first place? And could that be part of the design justice conversation, or does it always have to be like bottom up and, you know, giving agency to the folks who are affected, or is there a place for us to do that sort of power subversion work that could still fall under this big umbrella? And I'll just put it out there as a question.
I'd like to start out by apologizing for missing the lunch conversation. Seems like it was very lively. So if I say something which has been said before, I'm sorry. But I think the question of identification is inherently very violent. Like, you know, you exist as a human being, and the necessity of having a centralized kind of, you know, bottom-up approach to identifying you, tracking you, you lose your anonymity in every like facet of your life. It's inherently violent, even for those of us who are not, you know, refugees or in a vulnerable situation. So there is value. I just want to, you know, support your point. Like, in as much as there's value in like going to the, you know, to the vulnerable people to really find out, it is, I feel like there's a universal shared experience of that violence of having to do that in a way that the question can be, you know, like bottom up, like, okay, figure out what exactly we want from an ID, like what is the minimum amount of information to do what, and, you know, figuring out like what's the purpose of the ID and what's the maximum level of trade-offs we can do before even doing more of a, you know, people-centered approach. Like, the design can be more abstract. Like, what does the ID seek to accomplish? Yeah, I think that could be an angle.
That's great. Other thoughts? I mean, we have a group of scholars at ANU that do a lot of work with refugees around some of these issues, and I'm sure they're not, some of them have been online, but if we wanted to continue brainstorming, we might ask them to join us as well, since we'll have a few different kinds of experts to talk about their experiences given what they've done in their research. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if, to follow up on your point, there might be value in bringing together design justice principles with something like the data ethics canvas, which really thinks about how to not overburden certain communities that are already oversampled, overworked, made to do all of this work. Like, design justice is asking a lot of them, right? And so I wonder if we could think about a couple of these different approaches in tandem and see if there's something new we could come up with.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And then thinking through the ideas of studying up, you know, and for those that aren't from anthropology or ethnography, like really looking up bottom-up approaches to studying power to kind of understand how they might be mediating things on the ground could be a nice complementary point as well. Lauren, you were going to say something.
I'm totally loving all of these suggestions and loving all of our conversations. I'm going to pivot a bit to logistics because I have that organizer's concern that some of these conversations, which are not being recorded in any way, I have been live tweeting the sessions. They will be archived, but these conversations, other than notes that we all take, won't be. So I do have some thoughts on refugees in particular. I have a connection to a group in Qatar that has funds from the Sheikh of Qatar for providing scholarships for young refugees to attend universities outside of the area where they are refugees. So in other words, to migrate someplace else as students with documentation so that they can get the education that they want. And these might be very interesting informants because they wouldn't be under pressure. And also the people who organize this in Qatar, they have a lot of experience working with refugees, originally often from Afghanistan, but now increasingly from the many other places that need that type of thing. So again, you know, this continues the idea of partners. Logistically, since we have this wonderful conversation going, I don't want to, you know, I don't know whether we would like somebody to maybe be the note taker for conversations. Another idea could be to use the whiteboard sticky note thing more than we've been doing. A third possibility would be this wouldn't solve the problem of note-taking for the conversations, but we could move the whiteboard into the room where we have lunch and dinner so that whenever people get an idea that they don't want to forget, whether for the idea has been circulated of design justice principles applicable to AI, so an idea in that vein, a question that you'd like to ask, or perhaps in lieu of and in addition to the email that Vukosi circulated about people volunteering to give a talk, perhaps somebody might want to volunteer to lead a workshop during that time space on, say, brainstorming about refugees. And certainly, eventually, one of our outcomes for this group is a white paper of some sort and a publication in the journal Critical AI. So all this by way of saying is that logistically right now what we don't want to do is lose information or make things too top down. So if you like any of those suggestions, whiteboards, facilitators, whatever, just shout them out.
Anyone super excited about one option? I see no one running to the whiteboard, so that's all right. We can let it sit with us.
Would people volunteer to be a note taker for each session, whether they do it on their computer or in their green notebook? It's like, yes, it's like the Doris Lessing thing, you know, the green notebook. Okay.
We could also have a Google Doc, kind of a collaborative document.
We could.
Sorry.
Like a collaborative document that everyone
awesome.
can contribute, even though maybe it's better to sign people up for specific sessions just to make sure that notes get taken. But yeah.
Yes, excellent idea.
Any thoughts about that or a different idea?
I wish Google weren't the only platform that would facilitate that, but alas, right now, I mean, this is a constant problem that I face, that we don't have enough infrastructure out, and these things are not that hard to design anymore.
I was just saying we could use Etherpad if we wanted something that was open source and yeah.
Well, maybe like over dinner, a group of us can kind of set something up and invite everyone. Does that sound okay? Awesome, look at that. One decision already. What was that? A whiteboard committee? We can have elections now. We should have time. All right, well, we'll figure it out over lunch. Any other thoughts about the morning sessions, or maybe as we transition to accountability and safety? Any initial thoughts that come to mind when we think about accountability and safety, critical or otherwise?
I guess, yeah, in the accountability space, like what I'm thinking about, I guess, recently is, you know, time and time again, we're told these models are performing better than ever, right? You know, they're performing better on all these different benchmarks and, you know, state-of-the-art kind of systems. And yet, time and time again, we see these systems, you know, failing in certain ways, you know, telling us that we should be eating, you know, 1 rock a day, all this kind of nonsense, really. So I guess, you know, it's clear that the frameworks that we use to evaluate systems, and particularly I'm thinking about these generative systems, are flawed, right? These benchmarks are broken. And so I think when we think about safety, and I guess accountability here as well, what kind of frameworks do we need moving forward to kind of, you know, safeguard these systems from potential harms? I think that, you know, personally, I think, you know, we do need to kind of value this like qualitative form of evaluation somehow, which is kind of hard to operate at scale and hard to kind of standardize, I think. But yeah, I'd love to hear thoughts on that.
Anyone want to jump in? Oh, sorry.
So I wasn't going to respond to that, but just my own thoughts about what I would love to hear about from the accountability and safety perspective. And something that I've been thinking about in the deepfake space, Australia has just announced new laws to potentially criminalise the creation and distribution of deepfakes in the non-consensual image context, and the proposed laws have just been referred to the Senate for an inquiry and a report, and I've been invited to submit for that report, and I'm considering who should be accountable and how much they should be held accountable in terms of the actors in the kind of pipeline of the development, who facilitates this abuse, who profits from it. And so, yeah, considering the actors and, yeah.
No, that's great, and it's something that people can think through in relation to other examples as well. The multi-layered approach to thinking through that is terrific. Other thoughts? This is kind of a weird setup, actually.
Okay, I think something that stayed with me from this morning was around privacy, which was mentioned earlier on, and I'm a big person in terms of thinking about ethics. So in terms of refugee management, right, in areas or countries where it's not really regulated and there's no systems in place, in the design of those systems where you would probably want to do participatory action research, obviously, to get the people involved, how do you ensure that those people's privacy is safeguarded, but also at the same time ensure that those systems are not used for surveillance purposes?
Yeah, great reflection, and those of us probably can't promise that in many ways, so it's great to think through more, especially when we're thinking through alternatives and other kinds of possibilities. Any other thoughts?
Just a quick one, because I'm more on the AI practitioner side, and I wanted to, add some context to what you're talking about. So I think that's like Goodhart's law. Like whenever a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So evaluating AI models is extremely difficult, but the problem is as soon as you think out of the box and you get a new way to evaluate it, everyone rushes to optimize for that, and it ceases to be a meaningful target or benchmark. So it's always like the race of creating new benchmarks, getting them to become useless, and coming up with new benchmarks. It's Goodhart, like good, H-A-R-T. Yeah.
Great.
There's a digital humanities platform some of us were talking about last night that might be relevant to our thinking. It's called Mukutu, and it helps indigenous communities manage their own cultural heritage materials by selecting differing protocols for access and editing. And it's something that we might take inspiration from as we think about, if we were building data sets from people's data, like how could we think about differential access or something like that as a way to facilitate it? It's Mukutu, M-U-K-U-R-T-U.
Great. Thanks for that recommendation.
I was made to think in relation to some of the things we have already discussed. Like there's this term, like the Omosaka, Agamben's bare life and all that theoretical thing, whereby the bare life, most people use it mostly in discussions regarding refugeeism and asylum seekers. So the bare life has the state of, not necessarily, but it's a state of vulnerability in that way, a state that lacks form, and then the word comes from, like, the word Omosaka itself comes from this Roman usage. I might be wrong, but something about sacred, the sacred human. So that is the human that cannot be killed by anyone, but that same human no, the human can be killed by anyone, but that same human cannot be offered up as religious ritual. So it's this sense of protection without protection in any way. And when Alfonsina was talking, I thought about that strongly in that way that the state of refugeeism itself bespokes a nature of vulnerability, of being exposed, data-wise and all, such that it would seem then that the term or its practical implication on the manifestation of the world still needs to be problematized on so many levels before we can even begin to, let me not say before, if we are ever going to get a good sense of privacy for them. Like something you said about how, between life and giving your biometrics or leaving. And I was thinking that, is that even a choice for them, given the fact that they would readily just want to leave? So then that's made me strongly think of that term and the necessity of even challenging the positions of refugeeism, of refugees as refugees in the first place.
Yeah.
What? Spell what? Omusaka. Like it's an Agamben. It's also used by Anna Arendt. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the names right. So Omusaka is H-O-M-O, like Omo. Then Saka as in S-A-C-E-R. Or bare life. Yeah. That. Yes, that.
But that's such a good point and a reminder to us that we can bring different kinds of knowledge to how we think critically about some of the datafied systems and AI-related practices that we've been talking about, which we haven't quite done yet, but it's only day one. So thanks for kicking that line of inquiry off. It's really important. Any other thoughts? Oh, go for it, John.
This is more of a grim question or comment, when we think about accountability, but also translation. We've talked about design justice in AI, and we've imagined different frameworks for actually enacting it. And we've talked about earlier about subverting power structures. But to what extent could we actually make these principles happen? Especially when there's a big power imbalance between, states and small initiatives, and when we suggest or make Senate inquiries, to what extent do these actually even get taken up? So, or when we talk about ID systems, to what extent would a big government really prioritize or even select a small design justice enabled system as opposed to something like a big tech company that's already been well established, it's very well oiled and well loaded, and whether we like it or not, had a trajectory actually of successfully implementing ID systems. So I'm just curious about, well, how do we make things happen, especially, when we, even us, are still very reliant on big tech. So yeah.
That's great. We also have a comment in the chat from someone that said, there's a request to talk about time horizons. Another person has mentioned, I believe since we are bringing AI to society, to community, to human life cycle, such as systems that will be proven to be as fair, not opaque, measurable, and explainable. And I think this is what happens when you write something and don't get to say it, so it sounds a little awkward when I'm reading it. This would help in many ways to start addressing power imbalances and accountability. So a contribution from online that I'm sure will get developed more as we progress. Any other thoughts on that? Go for it. You gotta flip it, I know.
Yeah. So just, I wanted to just sort of give some directions for brainstorming about IDs in particular in a bit of a, sort of technical way. In this, what you want to ask the, IOM or the UNHCR what they want the, to track people for. And maybe they want to make sure that they've interviewed everybody that's arrived in the camp. Maybe they want to make sure that they don't give the same people provision through two different avenues. That doesn't necessarily require connecting the idea that you have to them to their real world identity. And it doesn't, and with computer technology, it's often possible to like encrypt data one way so that you can store an encrypted version, encrypt a new stimulus and check if they're the same without ever having stored the original information. So there are, what you want to think about when you're proposing these technical ideas is what are the harms how can you like sort of limit the information that the systems are keeping track of to reduce the risks of those harms. But when you're putting it in the design justice context, you also want to ask, what value do the refugees themselves get from IDs? And if the trade-offs of risk and benefits are different, for example, because some of the vulnerabilities that they have from being undocumented can be addressed by maintaining a chain of identity through a trusted authority, and you can put to the community whether those trade-offs are worth it. You can be a lot more confident that there's sort of democratic buy-in to the systems that you're providing, and sort of when there are trade-offs of risks and benefits, that's really the only thing that you can do to ensure the best possible outcome, I guess, and the fairness. So, just taking a step back, there's this bridge about just sort of what do we want the systems to be doing and what do people need that can be quite directly connected to the tech, and often, showcases some of the surprising capabilities of technology when it's, sort of designed in a way that's fit for purpose.
Yeah, that's great, and a great connection to the earlier point about thinking what we need in a foundational sense around ID rather than jumping into the infrastructure that we already have as the precondition. Terrific. Well, I'm mindful of time, and we said we'd start around 3:30, and we're just past that, and one of our amazing keynotes is already here. The other, I think, will be joining us in a little bit. So what I might do is I might start with an introduction. Actually, let me check. Yep, Brittney's definitely here. What I might start then is, I've got two mics, so I don't need two mics. Let me put one down. This is going to get tricky. John, you put this mic. I'll go back to the podium where I belong. So what we might do for the plenary, since we're starting off a little bit late, and Professor Brittney Cooper has been so kind in terms of waiting online for us to bring her on screen, I might start by introducing Brittney, and we can listen to her plenary speech, and then we'll switch over to our second speaker, Abeba Birhane. So while this session today is framed around the theme of accountability and online safety, our speakers are going to make very distinct interventions into this space. One about decolonizing AI as a question and provocation, and very shortly, Dr. Cooper will reflect on Black feminist perspectives and how they raise fundamental questions about online safety. And she's here on screen. Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Sorry for that awkward transition. This happens with Zoom and virtual sessions.
Yes.
So I could give a very long introduction to Dr. Cooper, but you
Please
all
don't.
here... Oops. I was just going to say, no one wants to hear me speak anymore. So I'll do a short version of Dr. Brittney Cooper's background, but please do look up more of her work. So Dr. Brittney Cooper is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies and Africana studies at Rutgers University, where she is also the principal investigator and founding director of the Race and Gender Equity, or RAGE Lab. I have lab name envy with that one. I think we all do. She's the author of many scholarly and public-facing publications, including Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women, and the New York Times bestseller, Elegant Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower, among many others. She also co-founded the Crunk Feminist Collective, a hip-hop generation feminist collective of women of color activists and scholars. And if you haven't read her work, there's a good chance that you've come across her 2016 TED Talk on racial politics of our time, which has been viewed over 1 million times. And if you haven't, you should definitely watch it. We can make it up closer to 2 million probably. So, Dr. Cooper, we're delighted to have you here, and I will turn it over to you. I hope that was short enough.
That was perfectly short. Hey, everyone. I'm really glad to be here with you and to share. So, good afternoon. It is good and early in the morning here in New Jersey, but hopefully we can do some good work together today. So I created a few slides just because I have some text and visuals make that better. So I come to this work as a digital Black feminist who co-launched a highly successful Black feminist blog with the Crunk Feminist Collective in 2010. To date, we are the longest running Black or feminist of color collective in the United States, and we continue to work together. Our intervention in feminist movements was about making academic concepts and theory more accessible via digital means, namely blogs. We lived through the rise in the 2010s of trolling, watching our thoughtful, caring, deeply engaged feminist community grow and shift and become subject to endless critiques, trolling, and spamming. At the same time, as we were building the collective project of the Crunk Feminist Collective, I was building a fairly sizable digital platform of my own with more than 250,000 followers across all platforms. And as my own visibility as a highly vocal Black feminist grew, so too did the harassment. Hold on one second. I have personally been deplatformed, having my personal website taken offline in 2019 by nefarious actors, seemingly based in Ukraine. I have been doxxed multiple times. I've had my address and cell phone number and email shared online. I've received hundreds of hate mail calls and emails, been profiled on right-wing news, and most alarmingly, I have been swatted at least once, but possibly twice, as on 2 occasions I received house calls from police indicating that violent incidents were taking place in my home. Because these kinds of harassment have become, in my experience, simply the price of doing business, which is to say the price of choosing to be a woman with opinions occupying the public sphere in a patriarchy, I have implemented a whole series of security protocols that I engage in order to offer a modicum of security to myself and my family. I've also, though, become a kind of go-to consultant for Black women in the United States who experience this kind of harassment. Just last week, a friend called out racism in a prominent workplace, had her tweet go viral, though nothing like that had ever happened to her before, and then had folks post her cell phone number online, and she received 600 angry and violent text messages to her personal cell phone. Much of the work I'm interested in doing then comes from this desire to make the public sphere a safer place for Black women, femmes, and gender expansive people to do their work, rather than a particular investment in machine learning, neural networks, and natural language processing, and the like. But the capacity to harass and violently target women and push them out of the public sphere is commensurate with the scalability of platforms, which means that we do have to ask questions about whether there is a way to build artificial intelligence tools that work from a premise or value of safety. And part of the challenge is that safety is frequently seen as a check on freedom, and freedom, apparently to harass and violate women, is considered foundational to the free reign of capitalism and patriarchy, not to mention white supremacy. So to ask about safety at the level of design rather than as an afterthought is fundamentally to acknowledge that systems of power structured the designing of the platforms in the first place. And that perhaps might seem like a basic truth in a room like this with scholars such as ourselves, but in the years that I spent doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI work DEI consulting and big tech in the US, it was taken as a gospel by all of the software engineers that I spent my days talking to that algorithms are neutral, which of course is absurd, because if they're not built by neutral people and they're not used for neutral reasons and they don't have neutral effects, there's literally I don't understand the investment in the idea that there is some part of technology that is pure and neutral, and it really comes out of a kind of positivist epistemology that says that there is some objective place in the world unsullied by politics, power, and violence. And that's not the kind of assumption that those of us who come from a Black feminist epistemological perspective would ever take or make. It is also taken as gospel, though, in these same workplaces that though it's a more inconvenient gospel and one that they are less apt to proclaim proudly, that diversity in the workplace decreases the merit of the workplace. And so akin to these kinds of problematic ideas rooted in this kind of foundational whiteness is that this idea that having ethics in AI runs squarely up against white conceptions of freedom that are rooted in colonial ideas about tabula rasa territories that are unpopulated by people that have any matter or bearing on the world. So that begs this question. So part of the reason that I got into this work is because so much of the work that I've done in Black feminist thought has been really about, as a first generation professor, the first in my family to graduate from college, to go on to get graduate degrees. When I came into the professoriate, we wanted to make feminist ideas accessible to communities of the sort that we came from. And many of us in the Crunk Feminist Collective are first generation to do everything in our family. Some of us even first generation to graduate from high school. And so last year, when I launched the Race and Gender Equity Lab, it was really designed to combat two problems that were tending to Black women doing feminist work in public. And one was access to pipelines for publishing, demystifying that kind of process, and just really creating more pathways of mentorship and things of that nature. But the other was to deal with the increasing scale of the kind of violence and harassment that was attending to women who were becoming more vocal online. And part of the argument for me is that this is actually not a new problem. It's an old problem with a new set of technologies to amplify it. So the idea that women do not deserve to occupy public space is a kind of foundational premise of patriarchy, that public space is the space for men and not even masculine folks. It's just the space for cisgender, white, male, property owning, able-bodied, typically rich, land-owning men. And that's not a new set of assumptions. What is new is the technologies available for people to enact the kind of suppressive, oppressive violence to push women out of these places, particularly Black women. So to ask about safety at the level of design rather than an afterthought. Oh, I'm sorry, I said this. Okay, let me move to this part. Excuse me, y'all. So why talk about then violence with regard to AI? One of the arguments I want to make today is that there is a Black feminist mandate to talk about violence. In her most recent book, Lethal Intersections, famed Black feminist sociologist Patricia O'Collins returned to Kimberly Crenshaw's very well-known concept of intersectionality to posit that violence is itself intersectional. And Collins writes, violence is widespread precisely because it has been and remains essential to upholding power relations and pervasive social inequalities. Violence is an essential tool of political domination, a situation in which one actor or group of actors imposes his, her, or their will on others. And thus she says that Crenshaw is often acknowledged as naming intersectionality as a construct, yet the significance of resisting violence as the immediate catalyst for her analysis drops away within the subsequent use of the term, especially within academic settings. And so the first sort of observation that I want to make in line with Black feminism is that to have an adequate intersectional analysis of AI technologies and systems, both at the level of building and at the level of use, is to explicitly attend to the problem of violence. The ability of AI tools as they are currently being built to scale and democratize access to violence as a tool of domination, and to use intersectionality in design is to prioritize a value that is about resisting violence. So it is not just enough to say that we're intersectional. And most of us who have come through the modern academy in the last 20 years have at least heard the language of intersectionality, at least pay lip service to the idea that we're going to consider race and gender and class. And if we're thinking more broadly, that we're going to consider international context, different geopolitical frames, power relations in places outside the United States, which more and more intersectional work has done. But it's not just enough to sort of like take up that project as one that's about like diversifying the people who are doing the thing, right? Which is very often how intersectionality gets co-opted as part of a kind of neoliberal politics of diversity, right? Instead, it is really to think again and again and to return again and again to the way that systems of power are structuring the building of these things at the level of their fundamental assumptions and at the level of who is doing the labor. And so it is both to think about violence as being foundational, given the fact that AI is being used to scale violence and to democratize not just access to knowledge, not just access to tools, not just access to all of the different kinds of things that the kind of techno-optimist point of view suggests it does, but that it's also democratizing and making it easier for folks to scale the kind of violence that they want to do to vulnerable populations, right? The second argument that I think is relevant here is actually to ask a really important question about what is meant by this notion of intelligence to begin with, right? And while I know that there are folks who are asking and thinking about that question, it is really important for those of us who are Black and brown to think about that question, because if you think about the kind of foundational assumptions of Western epistemology, it's rooted in the idea that Blackness is the intelligent force, that Black folks don't know anything that is worth knowing about the world. Those kinds of assumptions are sort of foundational to the ideas that we have about what intelligence is, what it does, and what it looks like. And so as we think about frameworks of design justice, we have to therefore consider the epistemological landscape of artificial intelligence. To talk about intelligence is to talk about what we know, but it is also to talk about how we came to know it, how we verified that it is a thing that is known and a thing worth knowing. And so in 1990, Patricia Holt Collins, in her first book, Black Feminist Thought, outlined a framework for a Black feminist epistemology, and it included 4 tenets. That is, that lived experience is a criterion of meaning. Dialogue is important in assessing knowledge claims. There is an ethics of caring, and there is an ethics of personal accountability for the things that you say. To speak of AI as having intelligence is to speak of various forms of artificial intelligence as actors or subjects capable of putting forth knowledge claims. And this means that there is an epistemological framework that informs the kind of knowledge projects in which artificial intelligence is engaged. But our being enamored with these forms of knowledge production assumes a world where epistemological systems were not always already a fraught space of power relations, and where the fight to have oneself taken seriously as a knower was not already a precious, vulnerable, hard-won, and ongoing fight. So it is really interesting and frankly wild when you're a Black person who is continually in institutions where the things you want to study and the knowledge claims you want to make are the kinds of claims that have to be justified on their face, to watch people then run to computers, to run to automated kinds of technologies and come back and talk about how smart they are and how magical they are and how much they know, when folks don't even want to acknowledge that Black people are smart and that Black people know things and that Black people are knowledgeable, right? And so you can imagine that there's already a sort, even as we like worry about the ways that these new technologies will sort of displace folks, that's not just a question about who's going to do the labor. It's also this more fundamental question about whose knowledge did we come to value in the first place, and what does it mean that at a moment when, at least we're experiencing a worldwide white supremacist backlash, largely because you are starting to see inroads where colonized peoples have been able to push back because of what digital technologies have provided in the way of speaking back to empire, to offer alternative narratives, alternative epistemologies, right? Alternative accounts of the land, alternative accounts of the technology. And so we cannot then tell this story of this moment and this rush to AI as a new frontier of knowledge as not also being about a kind of resistance to a set of resistant knowledge projects that have come out of Black and Brown communities. So another Black feminist epistemologist whose work I find incredibly useful, Professor Christy Dotson, who is a philosopher at the University of Michigan, calls out the problem of epistemic systems that are not, as she terms them, self-reflexive. She writes that epistemology may be one of the last forms of magic that colonial cultures allow themselves. They don't call it magic, of course. But she goes on to say, epistemological systems that fail to promote epistemic reflexivity, e.g. an awareness that one's epistemology has significant limits, generate bad magic. Bad magic here is another word for epistemic oppression. By bad magic, I mean the cultivation, she says, maintenance and protection of everyday practices that have a modal profile that includes regularly generating reckless and relentless harm. So using AI-generated images to create deepfake revenge pornography is a form of this reckless and relentless harm. Using the work of artists and writers and everyday people to train AI without permission or compensation replicates the very colonial logic that relies upon worlds already built to build supposed new worlds that are designed to extinguish the relevance and importance of the quote-unquote old worlds. A few months ago at the Atlantic, a magazine here in the US, there was a story about one of the early data sets that one of the early large language models trained on, and the way that the books that had been fed into that data set were books that were illegally obtained and stripped without any compensation or copyright to the authors. And so several authors I knew entered a lawsuit about these training models that, Facebook had used, Microsoft had used, etc. And the author, who had been a software engineer, took the data set, built a search engine over top of it for people to search to see if their books were part of the data set that the AI had trained on. And sure enough, when I used the search engine, my book, Eloquent Rage, that was mentioned in my bio, was one of the books that this data set had been trained on, with no indicators to my publisher or to me, or any compensation for that. So taking folks' copyrighted work that they toiled over, Eloquent Rage being a significant part of my life story, and using it to train the AI is another regular routine form of violence of a sort that these kinds of technologies engage in. So Black feminist insights about intersectionality as a tool for understanding power relations, violence as a tool of intersecting systems of oppression, and intelligence systems as always engaged in knowledge projects with built-in epistemologies can inform the design justice work we need to do to build safer worlds for all. As we think about what it means to build, my North Star is the work of folks like Jessica Marie Johnson and Mark Anthony Neal, who formulated in 2017 what they call Black Code Studies, a queer, femme, fugitive, and radical praxis and methodology that waxes insurgent as it refutes conceptions of the digital that remove Black diasporic people from engagement with technology, modernity, or the future. It centers Black thought and cultural production across a range of digital platforms. And so I show up to this work thinking deeply about the ways Black people in everyday life and context are using AI to transform their livelihoods. And one of the things that I want to offer, and that I think a lot about in my work, particularly because this is work that tries to think about AI from a critical perspective, is what does it mean to also hold the truths around the sort of colonial logics that structure the epistemologies that have produced this notion of intelligence as being artificial? What does it mean to hold this idea that violence is a structuring feature of AI to the extent that AI is being used to platform and expand and democratize access to violence as a way to shore up the very kinds of power systems that will wall people out of being able to make decisions about it? And also to consider that everyday people are adopting these technologies with rapidity and with a certain level of joy and jubilance and pleasure, because we too are wowed by the kinds of things that they are able to do. And so part of my Black feminist praxis is always to sit in the space of the gray. We call that a hip hop generation feminist praxis, right? Which the scholar Dr. Joan Morgan calls fucking with the grays, which is the ability to sit in the complication that it's not just enough to sort of think about this as violent, to think about this as engaged in kind of, replicating colonial logics. Because the thing that I know about being Black, having been Black for 43 years, is that all of the systems in which we exist were never designed with Black safety, living, thriving, surviving, or any of that in mind. And yet Black people tend to know this about technology, tend to be deeply reflective about this, and tend also at the same time to engage these technologies with their own ends and agendas. And so my example of this is that I have recently taken up crafting and crocheting, and that's another story for another day. But I go in my neighborhood to a local crafting shop run by two Black women. And they mostly teach like making earrings and making candles and soaps and doing different kinds of painting and crocheting and things like that. But randomly, they have a course on making images in AI. So a friend and I went to take this course, even as Lauren and I had been thinking and talking about this project together on campus. And so, I wanted to know, how did folks in the community who had no connection to academia, how were they thinking about AI, and what would cause them to come out on a Wednesday night to take a 3-hour seminar at a crafting shop about how to use AI? And so the facilitator said to the crowd very simply, if you need to make 2 or 3 extra $100 a month because you have a side business or something of that nature, then you can use Midjourney to make images that you can then own on your own server and sell or put on merch or things of that nature. And when we went around the room, that was precisely the folks who were in the room: people who own t-shirt businesses, people who own merchandise businesses, and who wanted to have more control and ownership over the images they were generating to be able to, scale up their business. And folks also shared that AI was a thing that they were feeling intimidated by, and that it was coming, and that they wanted to have some sense of what it could do and how to engage with it so that they were not displaced by it. And so here are some images that I made learning how to be in Midjourney. And I love these images and the other ones that I have generated. And I offer them as a way to say that, of course, part of what it means to have a critical perspective is to think about how we design for safety, how we don't give our labor to systems that are not designed for us to win. But it would be non-reflexive of me not to acknowledge that I'm a Black woman professor in the U.S. Academy in a university system that was never designed for me to win. And I have figured out, with a relative degree of success thus far, what it looks like to thrive. And so while conversations about agency tend to bother me because they often offer to us resistance as a salve rather than a more robust conversation about freedom, which is the sort of conversation that you want to be having if you want to be having a set of conversations about real choices and real options rather than agency as a form of resistance when you have limited choices. At the same time, these images give me pleasure. They are not the kinds of images that I routinely see in my day. I do feel some kind of agency to be able to kind of prompt engineer the AI creatively and to learn something about its racist assumptions about skin tone. I have to use a lot of food-based words in order to get Black people with interesting skin tones and hair types when I'm prompting the AI to generate these kinds of images. But even though these systems have never been built with us in mind, that doesn't mean that we cannot bring our own epistemological frames, notions of care and accountability, and forms of good, or at the very least, better magic to them, and to use them for our own ends. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that incredible provocation and set of insights. It's as if you were sitting in some of our conversations that we've had in the first 2 days, weighed into them, and have pushed us to think so much further. So I'm sure you're going to get lots of questions, but we might pause while I introduce our second speaker. Ah, there she is. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Abeba Birhane, who is an award-winning researcher who studies human behavior, social systems, and responsible and ethical AI. More specifically, she's a cognitive scientist who works at the intersection of complex adaptive systems, machine learning, algorithmic bias, and critical race studies. No small feat. She's currently a senior fellow in trustworthy AI at the Mozilla Foundation and an adjunct lecturer, which for those that work in North America, that's an assistant professor, in the School of Computer Science and Statistics at Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. And Dr. Birhane, I promised I'd give everyone short bios, but I feel like I should mention one other thing. I know you don't like to be called an influencer, but you've been acknowledged by Time Magazine as one of the most influential people in AI, so I won't introduce you in that way. I'll instead introduce you as someone who's been recognized for showing the value of being deeply committed to empirical and critical research as a foundation for generating new knowledge in the field. And we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for an excellent introduction. It's good to hear that people actually read my tweets still. So I will share some slides and I will go ahead and start my presentation. Can you all hear me and see my slides okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, it's going to be difficult to follow up from the presentation. Extremely insightful and yeah, the truth to power. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. And I will. We've seen a lot of momentum to decolonize this, decolonize that, decolonize the internet, education technology, and so on. Also recently, we also hear about the idea of decolonizing machine learning. So my talk is going to talk about, at a very high level, can we actually decolonize machine learning? In order to have that discussion, we will briefly look at what machine learning is and what the idea of decoloniality is. And there is also a risk that we cheapen the word to decolonize, or the word decolonization, as we insert it into every space without careful thought as captured by Pablo Chuque in this passage, where decolonization in Africa is becoming a buzzword if we are not careful. To some extreme, even big corporations such as Google that are really controlling the entire internet infrastructure system. Here is an example of Google's undersea cable called Equiano. Africa's undersea cable is largely controlled by just two or maybe three corporations, which is Google and Facebook mainly. And in some extremes, the fact that this undersea cable is named after Olaudah Equiano. He was the first enslaved person to become an abolitionist and an activist. Also, he's written his own autobiography on his journey through the transatlantic route. So he really is a significant figure, a significant intellectual figure in Africa. And unfortunately, the naming of this undersea cable after him is the opposite of decolonizing, is actually co-opting his name for the benefits of big corporations. Yeah, so can machine learning be decolonized? So in order to delve into that, let's look at what exactly is machine learning. If we trace the history of machine learning, it has deep roots in statistics. And some of us might know that statistics has also a troubling history where even various measurements relating to racial studies and so on are part of the excuse me for a second, I'm in a cafe. Where the root of statistics itself emerged from the need to create hierarchies for various races, and these hierarchies tend to put European Western men at the top of the chain, and disguised in science, these statistics have served various problematic disciplines, including race sciences, phrenology, and eugenics, and so on. And that's the root of machine learning. Also, the objective of machine learning tends to be to lighten the burden of in-depth understanding. We don't use machine learning to actually gain insights, in-depth understanding into a certain phenomena. We use it to simplify the process, flatten complex phenomena and processes. And also, so many of the concepts within machine learning and statistics that we have come to take as defining or as the norms within the field, concepts that we have operationalized, come from these troubling roots of statistical and colonial hierarchies and structures, including concepts such as performance. When we dig into what exactly performance is, we unearth how the definition of and operationalization of performance adheres to one way or another, directly or indirectly, to these racial hierarchies, and eventually to the superiority of the white Western men. And myself and my colleagues have done some empirical work into what the actual values of machine learning are. Performance is at the top, obviously. Performance, generalization, efficiency, novelty, scaling up, and so on. No surprise there. These are the kind of values that the field treasures. And when you dig into the definition and the operationalization of these concepts, again, you find that it adheres to its traveling roots in statistics, and to some extent to even race sciences. And we've also, these technologies, as Dr. Cooper explained, also tend, or rather are specifically designed to work and benefit those that are developing and deploying these systems. If you look at the influence within AI research itself, here in this slide, you can see that we analyzed 100 most influential papers in top machine learning venues, which is ICML and NeurIPS. And if you look at the first figure, you will see that only 11% of the most influential papers were either authored by big corporation or with authors coming from big tech corporation, or those that have funding from big tech. That was in 2008 and 2009. And 10 years later, that figure has jumped from 11% to 58%. So this shows that the field is, as we move forward, is being controlled by a handful of few powerful corporations, or all at the expense of, pushing out and excluding much more diverse researchers, much more diverse perspectives and sources. So, so what is machine learning? What are the tools? What does machine learning do? So I know there is so much buzz around AI, and there are so many definitions of what constitutes AI, from the idea that it's just a term that helps you with PR or secure funding grants and so on. You also hear idea, or you also hear that machine learning systems, or rather AI is systems that are somewhat simple systems that can uncover patterns from massive amounts of data through optimization processes. When we ask the question of what do we optimize, usually it tends to be, optimization for efficiency, and within big tech corporations, the optimization is focused on maximizing financial benefits. And as I said earlier, most models end up being systems that are used for making predictions about the future based on these patterns that are uncovered. So in a sense, as I said, we don't really use machine learning to gain in-depth understanding, but rather to make future predictions based on history, based on the past. And as we will see, this has deeply troubling implications. If we are, creating futures based on the past, and the past, as we know, is unkind, specifically to, minoritized communities, Black and brown communities, African communities. Datasets tend to represent these cultures, groups, and concepts, and so on, in an unjust way. But yet again, based on the patterns we uncover, we use machine learning systems to make predictions with very little care about what exactly we are predicting. Also, social systems, social phenomena, whether we are looking at, lived experiences of people, or, human behavior or action and so on, These are complex systems that have, contextual, historical, political, so many diverse facets, which is really difficult to capture in data. So no matter how great our data is, as we are building machine learning models, we are simplifying and reducing and freezing in time these complex concepts. And given the tendency of machine learning to simplify and flatten out these systems, we can say that, if we are using machine learning systems to build models of, say, physical or biological systems, the model might have higher accuracy with relatively less problems. An example is nowcasting. DeepMind has been excelling at this, where they have built highly accurate models in predicting the future for a very short time, the next 2-3 hours. Another element is AI models, for example, for in the board game space. However, as we move into the social space, this might be, using machine learning in any kind of social application, in education, law enforcement, finance, and even health and medicine, then we are navigating a really problematic space where the phenomena that we are trying to build a machine learning model for doesn't really lend itself to be captured by data then be modeled. I thought this would be captured by a really good quote from Geertz. This is from a book in 1973, where he describes the difference between a twitch and a wink. So to most automated systems, it would be practically impossible to differentiate between twitch and a wink, because there is so much social and historical connotation to this, and they do have different meanings, and mistaking a twitch for a wink, for example, can have significant consequences. So this is to signify how complex the social world can be when we are thinking about, building machine learning models or deploying models into these spaces. Another element of the entire field of AI and specifically machine learning is it tends to be built for profit. So the objectives tend to be maximizing for profits. And as I said, a handful of corporations hold outsized influence, definitely in terms of research, as I showed in the previous slide. And they are, even the state-of-the-art models that we are going crazy about, are built on exploitation of labor, as Dr. Cooper touched on, about the lack of compensation or even acknowledgement of artists whose work is harvested and used for training data. And the data, there are numerous issues with datasets. One is the fact that data is harvested without, our knowledge and our consent, but also the dataset itself, the content itself, tends to be problematic. So this is an example from an audit myself and a colleague did a while back. This feels ages ago. Given the pace at which the field moves. So this was a data set that was used to train computer vision systems called 80 million tiny images. We were the first one to evaluate it. As you can see here, we found several thousands of images labeled with the N word, the B word, the C word, and so on. And here you can see the first 25 images that I have blurred for presentation here. That came up with the word, the N word. As you can see here, most of them are images of Black people. And in a much recent audit, you can see here, this is a snapshot from the portal of the line dataset, which is now retracted. This dataset also has been retracted following our finding, thankfully. Here you can see this is using the word African as a prompt. This is the results that the first set of images that the line 400 million dataset would give you, and compare that with European. You can see that African is the concept African is presented in a very negative, tired, cliched way, with partially closed people with face paints and so on, whereas European is represented in a seemingly neutral images with maps and flags, as if the continent is free from politics and ethnicity. And it's not only images. Take the currently training data sets tend to be multimodal. That means they present, they have a combination of modality, so image and text, or various modalities. We also have examined the text from this multimodal dataset. This is a recent work from the line 2 billion. It's a dataset used to be open sourced. Now it's retracted following the finding of images of child sexual material. But here, to briefly recap what we did, again, I was extremely taken by Dr. Cooper's presentation, where they talked about how scale really exacerbates problems. And most of you who work within the machine learning field know that scale is one of the treasured values. You know, scaling up is something that is not only necessary, that is required within machine learning. And scale is often presented as a solution that will solve various problems. So we hear phrases like, you know, scale cancels noise, from prominent publications coming out of the labs of DeepMind, Google, and Meta, and so on. There is a normative assumption within the field that, you know, the higher the more you scale up, the more the good and the bad will balance out, and you will somehow end up with something close to the ground truths. And that's what we tested. We compared the content, the amount of hateful content within a smaller data set, the line 400 million, compare that with the line 2 billion image and text pairs. And this is just a sample of the texts that we run through a tool to classify, or to give you an example of how each sentence would be rated in terms of hateful, targeted, or aggressive. And the summary of the findings is that, you know, as we scale up, hateful content doesn't really balance out. It doesn't really disappear, as you can see here, for all hateful, targeted, and aggressive. As dataset scale goes up, so does hateful, targeted, and aggressive content. And coming back to decoloniality, now that we've said a bit about what machine learning is, what it does, and its objectives and assumptions, comparing that with the idea of decoloniality, first, it's important to acknowledge that there is no single theory or project or practice. There is no a unified understanding of what decoloniality is, but rather plurality and multiplicity of theories, objectives, focus, perspectives, and so on. and that is a strength, not a weakness. But despite these, different practice theories and objectives, we find some overlapping similarities about what decoloniality, what decoloniality should be about, or what we should care about. So one of them is at the center, as the central tactic of colonialism has been erasure of historical, cultural, and intellectual contributions of indigenous populations, so that a vacuum is created that can then be filled with Western narratives. Can you, for example, think of what Africa was like before colonial invasion? So that's the power of colonization. It's also the in of our imagination, our thinking, and as very well said by Steve Biko here, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. It takes away our imagination to even think about, our the contributors of our historical intellectual giants. And this is very true regarding the African continent. We have so many contributors from mathematics to medicine and philosophy, but very few of us are taught about these legacies in school. And this is partly the tactic of the colonizer. And also decoloniality is pushing back against the individualistic or seemingly rational and positive science, which has given us, problematic disciplines such as race science and eugenics and so on, and replacing it with relational, contextual, historical approaches that are grounded in the lived experiences, perspectives, and understandings of indigenous people. And at the core of decoloniality, we've seen that with machine learning, at the core of it is, it's a predictive tool. We use it, we build models to really make predictions. The idea of decoloniality, or the objective of decoloniality, is the opposite of that. At the core of decoloniality is really having an in-depth understanding of the phenomena that we are trying to study. So in this, not clustering or abstracting away or simplifying and reducing events and phenomena into simplified data. So this is one stark difference that might make the idea of decoloniality in machine learning an impossible endeavor. And decoloniality is also about correcting historical records that were intentionally erased or manipulated by the colonizer, and uplifting historical and current knowledge systems, it's going back in history. That's why we need in-depth understanding, so that we can engage in some undoing past harms and injustices, and as well as working towards the future in mapping alternative just futures. So given all this, it might seem that the idea of decoloniality and machine learning are just not fit together, or sit on the opposite side of spectrum. But we come from the idea that we work with, I like this quote from Stephen Lewontin, one of the greatest biologists ever, where the difference between defeatism and skepticism, the former leads to passivity and the latter to action. So even though the idea of decoloniality in machine learning seem too different, too radical to marry, coming from the idea of skepticism or not defeatism, we can think about how a machine learning system that adheres to the ideas and principles of decoloniality can be built. Even if it doesn't exist, we can envision that. But it does exist, as I will give you as an example here. But for an AI system to be truly called decolonial, it has to adhere to some conditions. For example, it has to be built, controlled, and owned by indigenous people or the people that is supposed to serve. And it has to be built with the needs and welfares of the people that it's supposed to serve, in a manner grounded in their epistemologies, experiences, and needs, and most importantly, and ideally, it will be built by such community themselves. And we also have to abandon, machine learning as we know it currently, because as I've shown a few slides back, currently a lot of things that machine learning cares about is like performance, scaling up novelty, generalizability, and so on. So we have to toss all those out, because the idea of generalizable AI, for example, like we have generative systems, they're just systems that don't have specific purpose or specific application, just floating around looking for like a hammer looking for a nail. So that tends to do more harm than good. So if we are thinking about decolonial AI, it has to, this kind of generalizable or general purpose or large or highly performing systems tend to be vacuous, and they serve the status quo. On the other side, they tend to disadvantage and harm people at the margins of society. We also have to abandon this idea of AI that serves all humanity. That's just wishful thinking. If we want an effective AI that adheres to decolonial principles, it has to be grounded. It has to have a specific purpose and application. It has to be built with specific groups to serve the specific needs of a certain group, rather than out of the box kind of something that serves all kind of applications. And we also see machine learning has so many deficits, but one of them is that thanks to machine learning, lots of like discredited ideas in the idea of reading people's emotional states or their attention or trustworthiness or so on, which was absolutely discredited back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is coming back thanks to machine learning. Because we tend, for the most part, because we tend to think of machine learning as if it's something magical, as if it can do tasks such as identify emotions of people based off faces. So it has to read off any idea of decolonial AI, has to read off all these purposes or these kind of applications that adhere to eugenics, phrenology, and physiognomy, and so on. And it has to also be a system that is built to help and to aid people, not to punish them, not a system that is like a gotcha. And unfortunately, most systems are, whether we are looking at applications of machine learning within the welfare system, whether it's in credit scoring, most of these systems are built just with clients in mind, not the end user. So they tend to punish people as opposed to help them. And it has to also be constructive and restorative, that is built on community values. This means away from the values of capital and capitalism, which will be a huge challenge. And Thankfully, we have an example. The Tehiko media, a lot of the stuff they've been doing really exemplifies the kind of take that can be free from, free from capitalist motives or colonial inheritances of these tools. For example, the very objective of, well, one of the objects, one of the projects that they are engaged on is building NLP tools for, applications such as machine translation. And the objective of that, the idea of that came from the need to resuscitate their dying language. They were, their ancestors or their grandparents were discouraged from speaking their language. They were in fact punished when they spoke their language during British colonial times. So the objective behind the project is to bring back the language. So they recorded the elderly several hours of audio data that was speech to text that was then converted to text that was they then that where the for example speech recognition models were built. They also have their own data governance frameworks where they make sure that they have absolute control and agency the data over who has and for what. This is the Maori data sovereignty protocols. So projects or communities like the Tehiko in New Zealand and these kind of NLP projects give us hope that it's possible to build a decolonial machine learning tool, but it has to adhere to the various conditions that I mentioned. And yeah, I'll stop sharing and I look forward to the discussions. I apologize for the background noise. I'm in a cafe due to problems at home. So I apologize for the background noise and some of the disruptions during my presentation. Thank you.
Don't worry, we heard you loud and clear. It was terrific. Thank you. And you've also helped us put together some pieces that we've been circling around but haven't said in the concrete and compelling ways that you have. So we have time for questions, and I'm sure there's lots. We'll have roving mics, but so what we might ask as you ask questions, if you could either address to either speaker or both.
Oh, there, I think it's right there. So thank you, Brittney, for those wonderful presentations. So I just have a question. So to what extent when we develop or when we think about anti-racism or decolonial, could we prevent new forms of colonialism or, intra-racial or intra-ethnic hierarchies from emerging? So for instance, a lot of the critiques in global health research, when we talk about decolonizing it, is that we introduce new hierarchies where particular regions that actually have more power or socioeconomic resources are still, in a way, dictating the new forms on which data is represented, on how agendas are set. So to what extent when we discuss this, we destroy old power structures, but then to how do we prevent new ones from emerging that would still marginalize countries or particular people with intersectional identities within those groups? Thank you.
Feel free to respond. We'll just take one
Dr. Cooper?
Oh, I was waiting on you.
I don't know how we can, minimize the introduction of new powers, but I think the idea of, for example, the use of AI within healthcare, that is one of the most recurring themes you hear, especially within Africa. You hear time and time again that, the continent will use AI to leapfrog development or, you know, to revolutionize the healthcare system. And most of the time, almost all the time, that is just a vacuous statement that will end up disfranchising and disadvantaging people further. So I'm not saying, this is not to say anything against the use of AI in healthcare, but we have to learn from experience. There is ample evidence, both from the global south and just globally in general, that shows that, you know, the use of these systems in healthcare systematically disadvantages people at the margins of society, any society. So any talk of, you know, the use of AI in healthcare has to first, you know, be aware of such critical literature. Actually, this is fact. It's not even critical. This is, you know, this is what the data is telling us. And we have to, you know, we have to ask questions: who ends up benefiting? So healthcare data is, for example, extremely sensitive, and the accumulation of large amounts of health data in the hands of powerful tech corporations or governments can end up, you know, being used against people, and it tends to be used against people, whether it's surveilling them, controlling them, or monitoring them, to including people from numerous opportunities and services. So we have to ask the question of, you know, how do we build it in a way that protects people from various disadvantages that arise with data collection and building models of these systems, and how do we make sure we build them with the interest and welfare of the people we want to serve in mind. So this is just a general comment. I don't know if Dr. Cooper will have specific response to that.
Thank you. First, I just want to say, too, that your presentation was brilliant and just so insightful and helpful. I took a lot of notes. I really appreciate you. The thing I would say in answer to the question about anti-racism and decoloniality is that we need to be very clear about what we mean when we say those terms, right? Because anti-racism is a part of a project of decoloniality, but decoloniality is not a metaphor, right? So when we're talking about different groups coming to the party who might gain power, the only colonizers on the planet are Europeans. They're them and their descendants are the people who keep on colonizing everything, right? And you know, there are some other countries that are trying to get in on the colonizing game for sure. And we can sort of name that. You know, look, I think the U.S. is, of course, a major colonizing power as a descendant of Europe. However, what a Black feminist perspective, I think, might offer is that what you want is more people in the business of imagining AI for their own communities, rather than thinking about this as like, oh, some other power will rise and then they will dominate some other group. I don't think that that's the right way to think about it. I think that it's more like part of what a decolonial perspective does is says that we know that we are on the way to decoloniality when you have a range of epistemological frameworks that are showing up, and that different communities are being equipped to use machine learning, to use artificial intelligence, to build these tools, to actually speak to the problems that those communities figure out for themselves. And that really speaks to this broader problem about how we regulate and break up the kind of big corporations and all of the corporate money that are shaping and limiting access of communities to being able to have this more robust framework. So decoloniality looks like everyone being able to kind of exist in their own space and do their own thing and be contributing, rather than kind of a worry about taking power away from one group and then situating that power with another group. And that requires us to remember that when we're talking about decoloniality, we are really talking about historical systems of power where people take over land. And part of what they're doing in the decolonial landscape is sort of, in the AI landscape, is framing digital space as a vast frontier of nothingness, right? As opposed to a landscape that is being actively produced by the labor of embodied people in the world. And it is because people conceive of the digital in that way as a sort of disembodied project that doesn't have bad material effects, that they can also then overlay colonial ideas about frontiers and all of that stuff onto the digital space and then act in it in ways that reproduce colonial logics. And so we have to be saying people produce the digital. The digital is a product of the embodied labor of actual material folks. It is not just some immaterial thing that exists out in the universe absent of embodied actors doing that work and that labor. And I think the more that we kind of continue to remind ourselves that there are bodies producing the digital, then we will think about the material consequences of who gets to do it and what knowledge systems have value.
Thank you so much for that presentation. My question is for both of you. We've seen the co-optation of the term decolonization over and over again. We hear there are numerous projects globally that are trying to decolonize AI, but are technically being deployed by colonizers themselves that do not have the principles, the values that Abeba, that you are referring to. We've seen also the co-optation of open source, open AI. All of us being asked to provide our data so that the machine can understand us. So I would love your comment in terms of that particularly. And then my second question is, and particularly to you, Abeba, from a practical point of view. In order to have a project like the project that you mentioned, the NLP project that was that's trying to help communities revive their language. So what needs to change from an infrastructure point of view, so that from a practical point of view, I know for most of us that are researchers here, what needs to change in order for us to be able to do that? Because that doesn't sound easy. We don't have the resources, we don't have the compute, we don't have a lot of the really critical, both philosophical but critical infrastructure that we all need. So I wonder what are the practical things that you've seen as you research that's required from an infrastructure and other point of view. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Wow, the $1 million question. Yes, I totally sympathize with you. African researchers are placed in a very, I don't know what's the word, precarious position where even in order to get grants, some of the requirements sometimes is open sourcing your sharing your data or open sourcing it, or making your science as open as possible so that it can be replicated and so on. And that is the scientific method, that's the scientific process, that should be the case. But unfortunately, that is not applied to everybody equally. It's no news to you all, but the company OpenAI, with a name like OpenAI, is actually one of the most closed company where independent auditors have very little access to training data, model architecture or model weights, or even API access. So it's as you pointed out, this is a structural issue. I don't know if there are concrete practical steps that we can take to equalize the playing field, because it really requires a radical really requires the entirely dismantling the current system that we have, where resources distributed unequally, where demands are asked unequally, as I said, while African researchers are expected to share their data in code, you know, wealthy, resourceful, rich corporations have no obligations. There is no legislation asking them to disclose such information. So, I mean, we can dream big in order to really have a society or a system that is somewhat just. You feel like you really have to throw out the whole system and build from the ground. But that's not practical because I mean, first of all, it's people with power and money that are at the position to actually make this kind of change. But also, I mean, I'm struggling to think of practical steps. Yeah, I think we need regulation in place that that is mindful of the issues, a lot of the issues that we're talking about. For example, the uneven distribution of resources and so on, and regulation that is built in mind or with the interest of sparsely funded, sparsely resourced African researchers to enable them to carry out the kind of science that they need to do while also protecting their data, their code and properties. I know it's a long step, but I think the only way I see towards that dismantling of the current system and building a new one is through regulation, step by step, gradually. I think.
Can I jump in? I think there's
Please.
one additional distinction that would be helpful, which is that decoloniality and decolonizing are related terms, but they are not the exact same term. And so decolonizing is about this kind of transfer of power and dismantling of systems that Abeba indicated, but decoloniality is a way of life. It is a mode of relating to all of these systems of power. It is a mode of challenging their assumptions, right? So for example, one of the people I cited in my presentation is Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, who teaches at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the US. And she has this massive project she's been working on called Black Beyond Data. And some weeks ago, we were talking about artificial intelligence, and part of the thing she said to me was, why are we enamored with data as an idea to begin with? Because so many of the processes by which data is collected related to Black people is already in itself harmful. The data is often itself false. It is often itself categorizing in ways that are violent, right? So a decolonial framework or sensibility around data is to have skepticism around the data itself. What are the questions that we're seeking to capture in that data? Is that the best representation that we want of the people that we're seeking to build artificial intelligence around? What kinds of data points would we want if we weren't thinking in colonial frames about what is the data that matters? What do we do about the fact that most of the data structures that have themselves been built are rooted in epistemologies that are asking very different kinds of questions about bodies that have to do with many of the values that Dr. Birhane talked about in her presentation around how you optimize the kind of labor that bodies can produce, around how you make bodies generalizable. And so what does it mean to think about data collection as not being about the generalizable, but in fact being about the specific, right? So you might move away from quantitative data, for instance, in all circumstances, to more qualitative forms of data. You might need forms of data that exist somewhere in a world that are not able to be thought of in terms of qualitative or quantitative, right? And so decoloniality is a sensibility that all of us can bring to the work, even as we think about decolonizing as a process that really requires a revolution, right? Really requires the overthrow of systems of power and money, really requires a robust set of structures that can help us to redistribute wealth very broadly. But day to day, we can bring a decolonial sensibility that questions what are the colonial frames that structure the kinds of knowledge systems that undergird the AI in the first place, right?
From that point of view, having this space to have this conversation is actually part of getting there, even though it seems a very small step.
Thank you very much. I know we're approaching 5 o'clock. It's 5:02. We've got 2 questions. I'm sure our speakers have places to go, so I want to ask, would you like to take them together or separately? I don't want to hold you up if you have to go.
I'm okay.
Same.
Okay, great. We'll take them both separately, and then we'll thank you for giving us extra time as well.
Hi, hello. I'm just going to make it very quick. Thank you for the wonderful presentations, both of you. My question is, I was playing around image generating apps the other day, and the question is a little bit controversial, but I think it's also very important, for this, for the conversations we're having. I was given the image generating apps and prompts to generate images on slave plantations and image around slavery, and these apps could not do that, because they've not been trained to do that. And my question is that, do we think that, does that, serve the purpose of decolonial or anti-racist frameworks and approaches that we have towards that we have and that we are also proposing more? Does it fit into the white supremacist agenda of erasing slavery, the history of slave, like we see in the banning of critical race theory in the South in America and other such agenda?
Yeah, I think that we have to recognize that these systems only know the things that we give them the data sets to know, which means that it is a perspectival limitation. That is what I was talking about when I said we needed self-reflexive epistemological systems, or else you're engaged in bad magic, right? So you can look at these image generators and they do things and you're like, oh, that's magical, until you realize that, like, when I tell it to generate me a black boy playing basketball, the only kind of black boy it would generate for me was one with dreadlocks or locks. So when I then was like, I don't know what they're called globally, but I was like, give me a fade, give me a Caesar, by which I meant like a low cut, right? So here I am at home, like, give me a fade, and it's like locks. Give me a Caesar, locks. Give me a flat top, lock. Like, and I was like, oh, so this tells us that the AI is not an exact mirror of our reality. It is an indicator of what the folks who are feeding it data sets think is valuable and what they think has been capturable in the data. And so much of that is really what these sort of white tech bros even can conceive of differently. The ability to sort of see communities of color with that level of nuance, right? To really think about all these intricacies around hair. When I was generating and trying to get this kind of hair, this is a very particular kind of thing. It's different than what Dr. Birhane has, right? Well, what kind of prompts do you put in the AI to get her hairstyle versus mine, just for example? Now, if Black people were building the AI, we would have hundreds of kinds of hairstyles, right? Because adornment and decoration is one of these sort of diasporic values that we hold. But that's not a value that white people globally hold. And I know I'm speaking in generalities, and that's the kind of generalizability that I want to engage in, right? Because everyone else is seen as, it is whiteness as a project that is seen as non-generalizable when it doesn't serve its purpose, while everyone else is seen as generalizable to the point of having no specificity, right? And so, sure, it's weird that the AI is not invested in a plantation, given that plantation logic structures so much of its own ideas about how you optimize labor, right? And there's so much good work about how optimizing labor per body is a calculation that is worked out on plantations that structures the kind of mode of how racial capitalism works. And so, of course, part of the way that coloniality works is to engage in acts of violence that wipe a landscape clean and then tell us that no violence produced this pure landscape for the taking. Of course, I mean, that's literally the essence of how coloniality works, is to eradicate what is there and then to tell us that this land was just here for free for us to build on, right? And so I think you hit the nail on the head.
To add to Dr. Cooper's comments, I mean, we can have a long debate on the pros and cons of these generative systems, either generating a skewed imagery of slavery or refusing to generate images of slavery, and whether that adds to the anti-Black decolonial project, whether that is just another process that is disguised as protecting the welfare of Black people, but in the end, just exacerbate stereotypes and adheres to the status quo. So, parking those debates about the particularities or the specificities of the advantages and disadvantages of this kind of image, generated or not generated, looking at the bigger picture, I think generative AI in general, the harms and the risks and the problems that are emerging from it far outweigh any benefits that it might bring. So this is like considering the mass amounts of data that is being harvested on a daily basis, again, without compensation, without acknowledgement, that then can be used in all kinds of tools that ends up discriminating against and disfranchising people. So from the data, from the massive amounts of energy required to run data centers, for example, in countries like Ireland, for example, the energy need to run data centers way exceeds the kind of the amount of energy that the country has allocated in the next few years. So in a few years, generative AI will really burn the earth to the ground because of the energy needs. This is before even getting into the massive amounts of gallons of water that is required to cool data centers. And you can go into other issues of the problem of hallucination, the fact that these systems are fundamentally unreliable. As a result, really, our knowledge system is really deteriorating. Now, people trust Google less and less due to the integration of, the AI overview, and justly so, because it's generating summaries that advise people to eat a small rock per day, to add glue to their pizzas, and so on. So when you look at all these different elements or all these different negative consequences, I think generative AI in general just causes more problems to the global in general, not just particularly marginalized communities, with very little benefits. I can't, most of the benefits I can think of are benefits that, fraudsters or people engaged in that kind of behavior might engage, to deceive elderly communities or so on. So that's my kind of higher level take on that question.
Thank you both so much for these really insightful presentations and these responses as well. I guess this discussion has really illuminated to me at least that training data sets themselves are broken, right? And I think so often we see this cycle that data sets are released, researchers kind of find something that is flawed in them. Often they're retracted, and that's thanks to your own work, Abeba. And then we still see these same data sets that are used and still circulated, say, like on third-party academic torrent sites, or just like through colleagues or something like that. We see ImageNet, which has been retracted for a very long time, still hold a very prominent position within the machine learning community, and recently Lion is still quite used for training data sets. In my own work, I kind of talk to people that create data sets, right? And I one response that we hear quite often is that they themselves don't feel accountable for the things that they create. These are the people that really have the most control over the things that are within them, right? They don't feel accountable for them because they can't control when they're used, how they're used, and this mechanism of retraction itself is broken, right? So I guess I loved your quote, Abeba, about defeatism and skepticism, right? But I definitely find myself often in this camp of the former. So I guess my question then is, yeah, what do we do when people don't seem to care that, you know, the data sets and the system is broken?
Another great question. I wish we had a very straightforward answer, but as you very succinctly put it in your own question, these are persistent problems that we are experiencing, and there is no single bullet, there is no single solution. So, but I'm glad you are on the camp of the skeptics. I'm glad that you haven't given up to defeatism. So that's most important. So we keep working, we keep fighting, we keep pushing back. We organize. One of the things we really lack, not only within the African AI research community, but also minoritized communities across the globe, is we lack coordination. If you look at, for example, to put it in context within the AI ethics versus AI safety research space, those that are pushing snake oil, such as existential risks from AI or rogue AI, these kind of absurd ideas, they are extremely organized. They have millions and billions in funds. They strategically hire people. They strategically place these people in various influential universities, elite universities. They place also their trainees in important, policy conversations. You find them everywhere in policy discussions across the globe. So they are extremely highly organized. So one thing we can learn from that is, no matter what community we are in, no matter how small the community members are, is to organize amongst ourselves and to uplift each other, to support each other, because at the end of the day, we are on the same side and we are pushing back against, the status quo. So keep doing what you are doing.
Any other additional comments? Dr. Cooper, did you want to join in? All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much for your insights and for being so generous in sharing them, and for staying with us a little bit over time. We really, really appreciate it. It's a lovely way for us to end the day and to continue the rest of our time together. So thank you. I think we'll be citing this for years to come. All right, I think that calls it a day. Thank you all. We'll have dinner and continue chatting.